Okay, in the first section, we were talking about China being second in the size of its economy in the world, but China is perhaps the most intriguing, the second largest economy in history. In this part, I will discuss with you what China has done right in the past 35 years for the Chinese economy to be able to grow so fast. Or some people say, is there a Chinese model? Well, I'm not sure, but at least China has done something right in the past 35 years. What are they? Now, in my view, they are a few things, a few very simple things which enabled China to grow very fast. First thing is actually very simple. I call GDPism. GDP, we all know that, right? The gross domestic product. GDPism is the phrase, a word I coined to refer to the phenomenon that in China, government officials, society are always talking about economic growth. Economic growth is the number one target of the government. Economic growth is the biggest politics in China. Deng Xiaoping started this tradition. In this picture, we have Deng Xiaoping waving his hand to people in a city in China, which is called Shenzhen. Deng Xiaoping said many times, also in his tour of this city, Shenzhen, he said, of all things, the most important logic is economic development, not politics, right? In other words, in translating into plain English, all other things are not important. The only important thing is economic growth. Deng Xiaoping is a short guy. He's also very short in his expressions. He doesn't waste words. So when he says what is number one most important, he really meant that. And how did this philosophy of GDPism, or this ideology, so to speak, changed China? Well, under this ideology, market forces were released. Because in order for the economy to grow, people in China quickly realized the market mechanism has to be introduced, even though the market mechanism was initially criticized as capitalist. But Deng Xiaoping had one expression. He said, the color of the cat is not important, whether it's black or white, so long as the cat can catch a mouse. That's the philosophy. And also because of this GDPism, China has to start certain degree of political opening up. Because when market forces come in, people get more freedom. More freedom propel people to participate in public policy decision. What do we call that? Politics. And because of economic development, many people demand more. Better air, better, higher, cleaner water. All these things propel the society to be more active in participating in social decisions. So all started with a simple philosophy, that is GDP. Without GDP, all these fancy things, forgive me, excuse me, I call it fancy things, politics, democracy, social public participation, policy making would not be possible. So that's number one thing in China. Second thing China did right is to open up. Why China has to open up? Because China has to learn. Early on, decision makers on the very top, realized that China has to learn. China was closed for too long, for centuries. China has to learn from where? At that time, leaders say, we don't care. Whichever country was doing well, we want to learn. Whether it's Northern Europe, Japan, South Korea, or the US. In China, there's one expression that you can learn even from your enemies. So that's the thing working in China. Here we have a picture. What are people doing this? Well, sitting in the middle of the picture is the Minister of Foreign Trade. He was signing an agreement for China to enter WTO. WTO is the World Trade Organization, which is a club of rich countries, or most countries in the world, to trade. And it took China 15 years to negotiate with members after members of the existing membership of the WTO, mainly the US and the European Union, in order for China to enter. Why the negotiation was so difficult? Because the US and the European Union were scared. They worry about a non-behaving Chinese economy, a non-behaving Chinese enterprises coming to the WTO and ruin the game. So therefore, they have to impose a lot of concessions on China. So it took 15 years to negotiate the accession to WTO. By the way, which country was the easiest country for China to negotiate concessions to enter? New Zealand. Because New Zealand has relatively a small number of products to trade with China. I often do kiwis and wool, and maybe dairy products, cheese and milk. So the simpler the economy, the easier for China to negotiate with. The US and European Union most headache. Yet, Chinese leaders did it. WTO. What's the outcome of China's accession to WTO? Explosion of China's trade in the world, starting from around 5% of the global trade. China's trade was 5% of the global trade at the start of the entry of WTO, to today's about 12% of global trade. China today is the largest exporter as well as importer in the world. So that's opening up. Well, in addition to this, the Chinese are learning. What are these Chinese doing? Well, these are students learning English, and they're consulting with advisors to do what? To go to abroad, the US or Europe, to study. The reverse of what you're doing here. Many of you are coming to China to study, but there are more of us. For each one of you, there are 10 or maybe 20 of Chinese students going to your own countries to study, mostly the US and Europe. That's today's situation. Here, in the US campus, whether they are Columbia or Harvard's, you always come across Chinese students studying there. And the number of Chinese students going abroad exploded. Right now, almost 500,000 Chinese students are studying overseas. Now, you can imagine, 30 plus years ago, people were concerned. They were saying bright kids from Tsinghua University are going abroad, never come back, because in the US and Europe, the living standard is so much higher, the wage rates are so much higher, they would never come back. Deng Xiaoping said, I don't care. So long as 10% of them come back, we win. Because the 10% of them can bring back good information and knowledge, talking about the information. So that's, I think, the second lesson of China's rapid economic growth. That is, open up and learn. Here's a picture of China's first German automobile manufactured in China. The name is Santana, which I think was originally designed in Brazil for the Brazilian market. I may be wrong. I'm not an automobile expert, but it doesn't matter. It's not an important fact. The important fact is that after years of negotiation, the mayor of Shanghai at that time was successfully able to successfully bring in Volkswagen to Shanghai to produce this car. The mayor of that city, Shanghai, happens to be, later on, a very able premier of China, who also was the founding dean of the School of Economics and Management. He was a dean for 17 years and made tremendous changes to this school. So this is a simple Santana of China's opening up to foreign investments. Again, there were controversies at that time. People say the foreign capitalists are coming to China, exploiting our Chinese workers, exploitation. Remember the manifesto of communism, right? That's Marxist classic work. Deng Xiaoping said, he said, come on, we don't worry. These guys are coming to China. They bring in their capital. Capital is in our hands. They should be more worried than we are. Their factories, their technology, their money is in our hand. They should be more worried than they are. They're not worried. Why do we worry? We don't worry. That's the mentality of opening up in China. Here, of course, is the logo. They are the logos of the World Bank and the IMF. I can tell you, being very familiar with these two institutions, and also I was consultant to both institutions periodically, that China has been the best student or partner of these institutions. Why? Here's a picture of Chinese leader Xi Jinping shaking hands with the managing director of the IMF. Why? Partly because over the years, whenever the president of the World Bank or the managing director of the IMF come to China, Chinese senior leader would always come out and meet them. And most important, these institutions often write policy articles, either advising or criticizing in a subtle way of Chinese economic policy. Chinese policymakers would tend to listen. They listen politely. They may say, oh, we'll carefully study this. And then, sure enough, in a few years, the policy advice from these institutions are actually being implemented. So today, China is widely recognized as the best students of these international institutions. Here's a picture of an economist many of you should recognize, Milton Friedman, the iconic economist of the past 30 years, who led the intellectual campaign of liberalism in economic policy. What he's doing? He's in China. He's meeting with a senior economist in China. Frankly speaking, I forgot his name. I couldn't recognize his name. I wish young people 30 years later wouldn't do that, still recognize me. Anyway, Milton Friedman, the iconic leader of free capitalism, was welcomed in China. Actually, he was met by the former party Secretary General of China, Zhao Ziyang. Not only Milton Friedman, all major economists in the US, in Europe, all find China being the most friendly country to listen to their advice. Here's a picture of a famous economist, Joseph Stiglitz. He is busy every year giving speeches, policy speeches, public speeches, or speeches of a commercial audience in China. I tell you an open secret. If I were a speech agent of all these Nobel laureates in economics, if I could organize an agency to introduce them to speak in China, I can be a rich man. Nobel laureates in economics, I believe, I claim, are earning the highest speech fees all over the world in China. China has the best audience for their economic ideas. So in China, if you say an event, I have a Nobel laureate in economics, people would come in. And this is a sign, I believe, of opening up of China to economic and eventually to other social ideas. The third lesson of China's rapid growth, I think, can be summarized by, for the lack of a better word, I steal from a famous company's logo, just do it. What do you mean by just do it? Just do it is a logo, a motto of Nike, right? Urging us to do exercise, to work out, to run, right? To walk. In China, just do it refers to reforms. That is, in China, there's general belief that debates about reforms is not nearly as useful as experimenting with reforms. Deng Xiaoping used to say, my only invention is no debate. I often ask myself, what if Deng Xiaoping is still alive today? Would he love the internet? The answer may be negative. Maybe he's not so happy with all the debates in the internet, which ends up with no action. He's a man of action. Just do it means just do the economic reforms. Just if there are disagreements, experiment. Let experiment tell the answer. This is the gate to a Chinese village. Happens to be close to my father's birthplace. A gate to a village of around 500 or 700 households. Very fancy. Look at the road, concrete, paved, hard road. Not the case 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago. Here's a picture of the village 30 plus years ago. Another picture of the village 30 plus years ago. This village was the first one to start the experiment of so-called household responsibility system. That is to dissolve agricultural collectives. That is to let households to work on their own. A dozen poor farmers in one winter, 30 plus years ago, gathered together in one room. They said, from now on, we will work on our own. We will not work as collectives, as the government regulates, right? And if we run into political trouble, we should help each other in their families. So if I were in trouble, please, the rest of us would help my kids. That's the spirit of just do it. Do the experiments. Sure enough, that experiment of privatizing the collectives was so successful that many other villages and counties began to copy. And that started the Chinese agricultural reform. And the agricultural reform was the first reform of Chinese whole reform program. Another picture of a poor place in southern China, a fishing village. And then this village was spotted to be a place to start economic reform by Deng Xiaoping. It's called Special Economic Zone. The village was called Shenzhen. Today, it is a fancy 10 million plus population city in southern China, bordering Hong Kong, and with population from all over China moving there. In fact, population from all over the world moving there. I believe the brother of the current US President, Obama, lives there and doing rather well, doing business there in Shenzhen. That was a fishing village 30 plus years ago. And this is a witness of the spirit of just do it. Let experiments show the outcome. Let the winners of experiment show the outcome. That's the success of these are the three simple, important lessons for China to be able to grow so fast. So if anyone asks me, what's the Chinese model? I would say, if there's any Chinese model, these are the three things. GDPism, open up and learn, and just do it. Start experiment. So these are the three important ingredients of the so-called Chinese model.